So our speaker today, we're pleased to welcome Kristie Miller from the University of Sydney. She will be presenting on the rationality of future bias and strong risk aversion. So please take it away.
Thank you. All right. I haven't decided if I'm going to stand up or sit down. I feel weird sitting down, but now I feel weird standing up because you're sitting down.
Well, the microphones are up here, so they'll catch you wherever. If you want to roam, it's fine.
Okay. Yeah, so the rationality of future bias and strong risk aversion. Okay, so this is a little bit outside what I normally do. I'm normally interested in the metaphysics of time, and in particular, well, both how time is in itself, but also how we think about time and how we experience time. And so in thinking about those kind of issues, I ultimately was led to do a bunch of sort of experimental stuff because there are various lacuna in trying to understand how we think about and experience time. And ultimately that led to me being interested in kind of temporal preferences and to questions about what kinds of temporal preferences people have. And so originally I was interested in that as a kind of descriptive project because I was interested in how the way that we understand these kind of temporal preferences might be connected to the way that people think about and experience time. I wasn't so much concerned with kind of normative aspects about kind of rationality because I feel like that's sort of outside the thing that I like descriptive stuff. Normative stuff, that seems like it's way above my pay grade, right? But eventually I was sort of drawn into thinking about these more normative issues. That's kind of where we are today. So in this paper, this is kind of an intersection of some empirical work, which is joint work with Andrew Latham, who's in Denmark, and David Brad Mitchell in Sydney. It's kind of the intersection of that empirical work alongside some kind of normative theorizing about future bias in particular. Okay, so what I want to do today is argue that a certain kind of argument to the conclusion that future bias is rationally impermissible isn't a good argument. And to do that, so some of what I'm going to do is to kind of cite some recent empirical work that we undertook in this regard, which is kind of interesting. And then I'm going to do something that's a bit more normal and offer some more armchair-based considerations. First, just kind of word of warning, none of this is to say that I'm up here defending the rational permissibility of future bias, right? So I'm not completely sure what I think about this. If you kidnapped me and forced me to tell you, like to give you some kind of answer about this, I think I would say it's not permissible, right? Certainly not obligatory, but for the purposes of today, what I'm interested in is just the status of this particular kind of argument against the rational permissibility of future bias. That leaves open there might be other reasons why it's not impermissible that I find more compelling. Okay, so what the heck is future bias? All right, so future bias is a kind of time bias. Note, bias here, at least as I'm using it, isn't supposed to be a pejorative. So just because something is a time bias doesn't mean that it's bad. It's a kind of open question whether one ought to be time biased or whether it's permissible to be time biased. Okay, so time biases, as I'm thinking of them, are preferences that are sensitive to where in time someone represents the relevant thing as being located, all else being equal. So the all else being equal here is supposed to be drawing attention to the fact that we want to hold as fixed things like the probability of the event occurring, its causal consequences, its utility, and so on and so forth. So the thought here is you're time biased if you're sensitive to temporal location, as it were, per se. It's not simply that you're sensitive to where something is in virtue of the fact that temporal location is contingently connected to other sort of normatively relevant things. So that's very abstract. To get a sense of what's going on here, think about chocolate cake. Okay, so suppose you've got an option between chocolate cake now and chocolate cake later, and I'm just assuming everyone likes chocolate cake. If there's something wrong with you and you don't like chocolate cake, like, I'm out already, Brad. This paper is not for you. No, actually it's fine, because later we're going to talk about kangaroo bones, and maybe that will be something you can get on board with. Okay, let's suppose I prefer cake now to cake later. There's lots of reasons that might be. So I might prefer cake now to cake later because cake now is fresh and cake later is stale. Now, this is a thing that happens to cakes in time. They get progressively staler, right? As a kind of contingent connection. So if the sole reason I have the preference for cake now over cake later is that I'm tracking freshness, I prefer fresh cake to stale cake because I'm like a normal human being. Well, I'm not a normal human being, but in this respect, I'm totally normal about cake freshness, right? If that's the whole explanation for why I prefer the cake, then using the sort of terminology I'm interested in, you won't count as being time biased per se, right? Because you're not actually sensitive to the temporal location per se of the cake. What you're sensitive to is relative amount of freshness, and it just happens to be the case that cakes are differentially fresh depending on how long they've been since they got out of the oven. Likewise, suppose I prefer cake now to cake later, because if I leave the cake lying around, some arsehole is going to come and eat it, right? So cake now is more probable than cake later. I value cake, so obviously I prefer cake now to cake later because of these probability considerations. Maybe God just really likes, me to have cake earlier than cake later, and I just really like to do what God wants, and so that would be another reason to prefer cake now to cake later. So none of these mean that I'm time biased. I'm time biased if holding all those things fixed, I still prefer, in this case, cake now to cake later. Okay, and if I did have that preference, all else being equal, I would be prospectively near biased. So prospective near bias is the preference, all else being equal, to have good stuff located in your near future rather than your further future, and bad stuff located in your further future than your near future. So you'll count as being prospectively near biased if I offer you a very painful dental procedure, you should say no because I'm not a dentist. But like if it's mandatory, right, you can have it a year from now or tomorrow. If you prefer to have it a year from now, all else being equal, then you're prospectively near biased. Okay, near bias is as well researched as fuck, right? So there's just, Dimitri told me I should swear, so I just took it really seriously. We know a lot about it because economists are super interested in it, as are psychologists. So there's a lot of empirical stuff about the fact that people show this kind of preference and how they do. Future bias, however, is way less considered. So it is the preference, all else being equal, for negatively balanced events to be located in the past rather than the future, and positively balanced ones in the future rather than the past. So, example. So here we have Freddie. If you were at the AAP a few weeks back, you would have met Freddie. Well, at least if you went to the same heap as I did, you would have met Freddie. Here he is. He's a Labradoodle. So let's suppose it can either be the case that he received a tasty bone to chew yesterday for an hour, or that he will receive a tasty bone tomorrow to chew for an hour. And suppose that all else is equal. So the probability of receiving the bone is the same regardless of where it is. The quality of the bone is the same regardless of where it is, and so on and so forth, right? And there's nothing else that's relevant. So for instance, it's not more likely that Freddie will choke on the bone if he had it yesterday rather than if he had it tomorrow. Okay, so if Freddie's future bias, he's going to prefer that he received the bone tomorrow. He will receive the bone tomorrow rather than yesterday, right? Because the bone, Freddie, by the way, just in case you did not know this, the bone is positive for Freddie. If he's time neutral, he'd be indifferent between these options because the kind of expected utility from a time neutral perspective is the same, because everything's the same about the bone, kind of regardless of where it's located. I don't actually know whether Freddie's future biased or not because he's a dog. Likewise, another example, suppose he can either have had the painful leptospirosis vaccination yesterday, or he can have it tomorrow. Again, all else is equal. There's no risk of leptospirosis in the intervening moments. If he prefers that he had it yesterday rather than tomorrow, then he's future biased. You should get your dog vaccinated for leptospirosis. This is a public service announcement, just in the middle of this paper. Okay, so we've run quite a lot of studies on future bias at the Centre for Time because there were no studies on what future bias looks like. There were a number of philosophers who had hypothesized that normal people would be future biased, but there had been no work on this. So we now know, perhaps unsurprisingly, that most people, in fact, a majority are in fact future biased. So they will prefer the positive event to be future rather than past. We also know not just that they have that preference, but that it's not just a tiebreaker between equally intrinsically valuable states of affairs. So in fact, it's a very robust kind of preference where people will prefer experiencing more pain in the past to less in the future, and they'll prefer experiencing less pleasure in the future to more in the past. So in particular, in one of our studies, we found that people preferred 10 units of pain as long as it's in the past over 1 in the future. So they're actually preferring 10 times more pain as long as it's appropriately located. They don't have that preference when it comes to pleasures, but if you're comparing 1 unit of pleasure to 2 units of pleasure, they will prefer 1 in the future to 2 in the past. So they prefer half as much pleasure as long as it's future located. They don't, at the point where you offer them 10 times the amount of pleasure in the past compared to the future, they actually switch back to preferring the past pleasure, thank God. Okay, so if people could in fact act on future bias preferences, they would not be maximising time neutral utility. Far from it, right? They would just be heaping a ton of pain on their past selves. They would bring it about that from that perspective, they're overall worse off. Okay, so future bias is usually thought to be kind of intimately connected with what's known as the temporal value asymmetry. And in fact, until super recently, people just thought that it simply was a manifestation of that asymmetry. It was sort of nothing but that asymmetry. So the temporal value asymmetry is a phenomenon in which people accord less value to states of affairs that are past compared to future. And the first people who kind of investigated this were one of my collaborators, Eugene Caruso, and Wilson and Gilbert in 2018. So they ran a little study in which they gave people a vignette that said, look, there's some boring work that has to be done, and either it was done a month ago or it will be done in a month's time. But the work itself is all the same. And then they asked people to award compensation for the work that either happened a month ago or that will happen in a month's time. And they found that people awarded considerably more compensation for the future work than the past work. So this was the first experimental vindication of the idea that there is this temporal value asymmetry. And again, this is something that philosophers had hypothesized about, but there hadn't actually been any evidence. So obviously you can kind of model this asymmetry in value in terms of a kind of temporal discounting function, just the way that economists model year bias with a temporal discounting function. But it's just going to be one that discounts the value of past states compared to future ones. Okay, and you can see why if you have a temporal value asymmetry, you can see why you would think that that will lead people to being future biased. You can even see why you would think that future bias just is a manifestation of that, right? So if you are such that you devalue past states of affairs relative to future ones, then if you have a negative state of affairs, of course it makes good sense to prefer that it's in the past rather than the future, because it has this negative utility, but the negative utility it has in the past is less than the negative utility it would have were it in the future, right? So it's kind of worth less badness to you if it's located in the past. And conversely, future stuff have more utility when they're in the future compared to the past. And since they have positive utility, they'll have more positive utility when they're future relative to when they're past. So it will make sense that people prefer the good stuff to be in the future and the bad stuff to be in the past, right? Because then the badness is worth less and the goodness is worth more. I'm not going to take any stand on whether future bias is nothing but a manifestation of the temporal value asymmetry. That won't matter for our purposes. Okay, so the normative status of future bias. So in what follows, I'm just going to blindly assume that it makes sense to ask whether preferences are rationally permissible, impermissible, or obligatory. Of course, you might deny this. Maybe you're some kind of Humean who thinks that you just can't rationally evaluate preferences, or at least you can't rationally evaluate non-instrumental ones. Or maybe you think you can't evaluate individual preferences, you can only ever evaluate whole sets of them, and I'll talk about that aspect a little bit later. But since I'm interested in sort of evaluating a particular argument regarding the normative status of future bias, I'm just going to take on board what my interlocutor assumes, which is that we can at least sensibly ask questions about the kind of rational status of these kind of preferences. All right. So many philosophers, in fact, probably most, have thought that future bias is at least permissible. And then a bunch of them have gone on to say not only is it permissible, but it's obligatory. And some have thought that not only is it permissible to accord past states of affairs less value than future ones, but that it's just fine to accord them no value whatsoever, right? I find this a startling contention, but newsflash, thank God, people are not like that. So their discount, in fact, what we found is that their discount function over past states at population level looks roughly the same as their discount function over future states. So what you find is that, roughly speaking, people hyperbolically discount into the future, so they more steeply discount the value of near things compared to past things. Well, they do the same, interestingly, they do the same over past. So the discount function looks the same, it just looks, it's kind of backward looking at population level. Thank goodness. Okay, so here's a kind of interesting thing. Most philosophers, even if not economists, think that near bias isn't rationally permissible. So they're like, yeah, no, you shouldn't be privileging the kind of well-being of your temporally nearer selves, temporally future nearer selves over your temporally further away ones. Like that's a bad look. Right? I think almost everyone, not everyone, but it's never going to be everyone in philosophy, but almost everyone is kind of on board with that. Economists, of course, are a different breed. They think, yeah, it's fine as long as you don't hyperbolically discount. You can fuck your future selves as much as you want as long as your curve is correct. But that sounded unduly aggressive against economists. Sorry, economists. So this is kind of notable because, and it was something that puzzled me quite a bit when I started thinking about this, because one of the arguments for the idea that near bias is permissible is this idea that it's kind of arbitrary to privilege the well-being of some selves over others. So the thought is like, look, you've got all these future selves. Like, what on earth could justify treating the nearer ones better than the further ones, right? And that's one of the arguments that philosophers in particular, have kind of mounted against near bias. That's not the kind of argument that economists give, obviously. But notice that future bias is just one way of privileging some selves over others. It's just that instead of privileging kind of temporally close, near ones to temporally far ones, you're privileging future ones over past ones. And one's initial thought might be, why on earth would it be fine to privilege the future ones over the past ones, but not the near over the far? At least I found that puzzling. It's like, I don't understand why this arbitrariness argument is not just a perfectly general argument. And there's kind of two sources that you might, maybe there's more than two, but there's at least two sources of places where you might try and put your foot in to cleave the near bias from the future bias. So some philosophers locate the kind of source of the difference in the nature of time itself. So here I am back on home turf. So these philosophers think, look, there's some kind of metaphysical difference in kind between past and future, but not between far future and near future. So usually these philosophers think, well, time is genuinely dynamical, so that there's a particular moment or set of events that are objectively present, but which those are changes as time passes. And then roughly the idea is, look, this is supposed to ground it being permissible to discount the value of past states compared to future ones, but not far future ones over near ones. And the idea, I think, insofar as I can try and simulate feeling the pull of this, is, look, all of these future things will be present. So they're all kind of coming towards us, and they all share this same status of going to, like going to land on me, right? Whereas all of the things that are in the past are over and done with in some deep metaphysical sense. And so the idea is, look, there's no normative difference between near future and far future. They're all going to come and become, present. And there's no normative difference between the near past and the far past, but there is this normative difference between the past and the future, because the past stuff is done and dusted in some deep way. So people who have this view will often think that there is this normative difference between near bias and future bias, and in fact they often couple it with the claim not just that future bias is permissible, but it's actually obligatory, right? You should be discounting past stuff precisely because it is over and done with. Okay, that's not the kind of argument that I'm going to be interested in this paper, although I do have some work on that. Here's another reason you might think that future bias is rationally at least permissible. You might think something like, look, surely future bias is completely inert, and so it's kind of harmless, right? So you might think future bias is inert if the preference isn't action guiding. And it does seem, at least on the face of it, that future bias falls into this category, right? So let's suppose we ask Freddie, like, dude, it can either be that you received the leptospirosis injection yesterday or you're going to get it tomorrow. What do you want? To be fair, his English is not that great, but let's suppose that he's like, yeah, I prefer that I had the injection yesterday. Okay, here's our problem. Neither Freddie nor myself have any capacity to make it the case that he had it yesterday, right? So either he did or he didn't. But there's nothing we can do kind of to make it the case that his preference is satisfied if he prefers that it was yesterday. It's either satisfied already or it's not. So you might think something like, look, maybe it would be bad to act on future bias preferences. Like, maybe not, but maybe it would, because you would end up bringing about states affairs that leave you overall from a time neutral perspective worse off, because if Freddie was just allowed to like have his druthers, he would be bringing about that he has more bad in the past over less in the future. So he would bring it about that overall he has, you know, more bad in his life. But Freddie doesn't have his druthers, right? He can't just, there's many things he can do, because I'm pretty, you know, laid back with dogs. But this is not like time travel, that's not retrocausation, that's beyond my care. Now, so you might think, well, this is a good reason to think that the kind of future bias preferences are harmless and therefore kind of permissible. I'm not endorsing that reasoning, by the way. I'm just saying that's a motivation somebody might have. Okay, so what I'm interested in today are arguments that aim to show that future bias preferences are not inert, they can do harm, and therefore they are impermissible. All right, and in particular, there's a number of recent, well, relatively recent arguments that aim to show that when you combine future bias preference with some other kind of preference, what you get is not inert. And then from there, the move is made that, look, the combination of the preferences leaves us worse off from a time neutral perspective. So the combination of preferences is a no-go, right? The combination of preferences is rationally impermissible because that combination, as it were, gets you in the shit. I'm just still trying to help Dimitri out here. And so the move then is made, well, look, at least one of the preferences in the combination must be irrational. And so the further move is then made, okay, well, here's what's in the combination. This guy is good, this guy is good, this guy is good. The only man standing that can be not good is future bias, so he must be the problem guy. Right. All right. So here's one kind of example of the way that goes. On the right here, we have Annie. You would have met Annie at the AAP, but she had a catastrophic hemorrhage the week before, and she ascended to the Rainbow Bridge. No, she didn't, because there's no Rainbow Bridge, but if there were a Rainbow Bridge, that was where she would have gone. Okay, so Green and Sullivan in 2015, they're interested in the combination of future bias and regret aversion, where regret aversion is you regret something for them, just in case you wish that you'd had some other preference. Okay, so here's the case, reconfigured to be about dogs. So we have Annie and Freddie. They're both excited because I bought this huge kangaroo bow. So if you didn't like the cake example, this might be more up your alley. We have to make a decision about who gets to chew first and who gets to chew second, because they're pretty chill dogs, but you cannot let two dogs loose on one bow. Like that shit won't run. Okay, and now we have to specify some more stuff, namely that the chewing is going to be equally good regardless of who chews first. Note, this is not true of actual bones. It's true of this bow, right? All right, so Freddie's future biased, but he's not near biased. So here's Freddie, and he's quite sophisticated. So his reasoning as follows. He's like, look, if I chew first, then after I've chewed, Annie and I are going to be in two different situations. I'll have already had my chewing, and her chewing will be to come in the future. But at that point, I'm going to wish that I had chosen to chew second, right? Because at that point, I'm going to look back and all my chewing is in the past, but I'm future biased. So that chewing now has less value than it would have to me if I still had future chewing to be done. So whereas Annie is going to be in the position of just having future chewing, and that future chewing is more valuable to her. So I'm going to be like, oh, dude, I wish I were in Annie's position. And I can foresee that I'm going to wish that I was in Annie's position. But if I choose second, then I'm never going to be able to be in a position to have to regret that choice, because after Annie will chew, that's still fine. I still have future chewing experiences. Well, after we both chewed, we both have just past chewing experiences, right? So there's kind of no basis on which there's no basis at that point to wish that I were in her position. So Freddie will prefer to chew second than to chew first. So the first thing to note here is that this case seems to suggest that future bias isn't inert. So Freddie has an actual choice here between chewing first and chewing second, and it actually the fact that he's future biased and regret averse makes it the case that he prefers to chew second rather than first. Okay, so we can now change the case a tiny bit. Like Freddie really wants to chew second because he doesn't want this, he wants to avoid regret. So he's going to be prepared to pay a very small amount of what I call a bone cost to do this, right? So the bone cost is that he's going to accept a very, very slightly smaller bone if he gets to choose second rather than first. It's going to be pretty much, you know, it's not a lot smaller because like he really does like his bones. Okay, so suppose he's prepared to make that, you know, in order to get to 2 he's prepared to have this very slightly smaller bone. Well, now it seems like his future bias preferences are leading him to prefer to be worse off overall from this kind of time neutral perspective, right? Because he's getting a bone that is very slightly smaller than the bone he would have had if he chewed first and he hadn't been future biased. Okay, so what Green and Sullivan say is, look, there's reason to think that the combination of future bias and risk aversion is not rationally permissible, precisely because Freddie has ended up by having those preferences by accepting a slightly smaller bone than the bone that he would otherwise have accepted. Freddie really likes bones. And then the thought, and we're going to delve into this much more, is that if the combination of the preferences is impermissible, then at least one of them must be impermissible. And then Green and Sullivan say, look, surely avoiding regret is permissible. Like maybe it's not obligatory. Parfit's like, you know, thinks that it's certainly not an obligatory thing to have to be such that you make choices that will avoid, you know, later regrets. Nevertheless, it seems like it's at least permissible to act that way, right? To think to yourself, man, my future self is going to really regret this shit. I'm not going to do that, right? That seems like something that is permissible. But if one of them is impermissible and avoiding regret isn't that guy, then the only guy left standing is future bias. It must be future bias, must be the problem. Okay, Tom Doherty offers a similar argument against future bias, but now he's going to appeal to the combination of future bias and strong risk aversion. So here I'm taking strong risk aversion is being willing to pay some cost in order to decrease the badness of the worst outcome. It's not just preferring that the gap is smaller, it's being prepared to actually pay something to bring that about. Okay, and the argument that he offers is structurally kind of the same as the one that Megan Sullivan and Preston Green give, which is roughly, look, this combination is going to get us into trouble, so the combination is impermissible, so one of the preferences must be impermissible, but it's not strong risk aversion because that guy's fine, so future bias must be bad guy here. Okay, and the way we get to that conclusion is that Tom tries to show that people who are both future biased and strongly risk averse can be turned into pain pumps. So someone's a pain pump if they're going to make a series of choices that is certain to leave them with more pain at some time, no less pain at any other time, and no compensating benefit, right? So, and Tom's thought is being turned into a pain pump is a bad thing. I think I'm with him there, right? Making choices that may create more pain sometime and no pain any other time, and no other goodness. That seems like bad shit. Okay, so here's Tom's thought experiment, and this is supposed to show you why combining future bias with strong risk aversion gets you into trouble. So we have this person who knows that it's Sunday, and they know that they're going to face some operations. And there's kind of two schedules that the operations can be on, but they don't know which of these is going to happen. So the first schedule is going to be that they will have a 4-hour operation on Monday and a 1-hour, I think that says 1 under there, operation on Thursday. Or they can just have a 3-hour operation on Thursday. And unfortunately, because it's a philosophical thought experiment, they have to remain awake during the operation. And every minute of the operation, of both of the operations, or all the operations across both options, feature the same amount of intense pain per minute of pain that you get. Okay, so it's Sunday, and the idea is that this person who's in this situation is offered a help early pill. So the effect of the pill is to decrease the length of pain on Thursday by 29 minutes if you're on the first schedule, and to increase the length of pain on Thursday by 31 minutes if you're on the second schedule. So here's what will actually happen. The thought is, look, if you're strongly risk averse, you're going to accept that pill. Because that's going to it's going to reduce the gap between the overall amounts of pain, right? So if you take the pill, then you reduce the pain you get on the second operation, that is the Thursday operation, by 29 minutes. So you'll have 31 minutes of pain on Thursday instead of the 1 hour that you would have had. And that means that you'll end up with a total of 4 hours and 31 minutes of pain across your total operation pool instead of the 5 hours that you would have had, right? So 4.5 compared to 5. If you're on the second schedule, then you'll increase the length of pain on the single Thursday operation by 31 minutes. So instead of having 3 hours of pain, you'll get 3 hours and 31. So what you'll have done by taking the pill is close the gap. So instead of having 5 hours of surgery versus 3 hours spread across these days, you'll have shrunk the gap so that you have 4 hours 31 versus 3 hours 31, right? And if you're strongly risk averse, the thought is you'll be prepared to, you will want to do that, right? Because you want to shrink the gap between the very worst thing, which is like a 5 hours, and the best thing, which is 3 hours. Okay, now the thought is you wake up on Wednesday and you have temporary amnesia, so you don't know what happened on Monday. And the doctor comes by and offers you a help late pill that increases the length of pain on Thursday by 30 minutes if you're on the first schedule and decreases it by 30 minutes if you're on the second schedule. And the thought is, look, if you're a future biased, risk-averse person, you'll accept this pill too because it also reduces the severity of the worst outcome. And it does that for free because your expected future pain is obviously the same because it's increased by 30 minutes in one case and decreased by 30 minutes in the other. Okay, so that's the setup. But now notice that by taking both pills, you guaranteed yourself 1 more minute of pain for no compensating benefit, regardless of which schedule you're actually on. So this is a little table that shows that. So you're up 1 by taking both pills. Okay, that seems bad. So what this is supposed to show is that combining these 2 kinds of preferences can result in you making a sequence of choices which has effectively turned you into a pain pump, right? I mean, you've actually been pumped that much pain, not that much pain has been pumped into you, but we could continue to pump. So the thought is it must be that the combination of future bias and strong risk aversion is not permissible. All right, so we can kind of schematically represent these 2 kinds of arguments where P2 is going to be future bias and P1 is either going to be regret aversion or strong risk aversion, depending on which argument it is that we are interested in. So here's my rendition of the argument. And most of the rest of the paper we're going to be interested in premises 2 and 3. Okay, so here's a schematic thing. The combination of preferences P1 and P2 is rationally permissible if it leads to the agent who combines those preferences being worse off in some respect and no better off in any respect, right? So that's just kind of spelling out the idea that some combination is impermissible if it leaves you worse off in some way and better off in none. And I'm just going to assume for current purposes that we're all happy with that. That does in fact make a combination impermissible. Of course, you could take umbrage with that, but one can only take umbrage at so many things. So premise 2, if each of P1 and P2 is rationally permissible, then the conjunction are permissible unless there's a strong intuitive purchase on the mechanism that rules out their combination. And I'm calling this thing additivity, and we're going to talk about that quite a bit more. At this point, you'll be thinking, where the fuck did that just suddenly come from? And we'll see why that just appeared in a second. Premise 3, there's no intuitive purchase on the mechanism that rules out combining P1 and P2. I've unfortunately called this intuitive purchase. I should have called it no intuitive purchase for very obvious reasons. You can see why it's going to be very confusing. So therefore, at least one of P1 and P2 is rationally permissible. Since P1 is permissible, P2 is rationally permissible, right? And P2 is future bias in this case. All right. So I'm going to be interested in the status of that argument when we plug in future bias and strong risk aversion, partly because some of the things I want to say appeal to some empirical work we did, but quite a bit of what I say about the status of additivity and intuitive purchase are armchair reflections, not empirical, so that will generalize to the kind of Sullivan and Green argument as well. All right, additivity. So additivity says if each of P1 and P2 is rationally permissible, then the conjunction is permissible unless there's strong intuitive purchase on the mechanism that rules them out. Okay, where did this guy come from? So we need some kind of principle that allows us to infer that if a combination is impermissible, then unless we have some kind of intuitive purchase on why this is so, we should conclude that at least one of the premises is kind of singly rationally impermissible, right? So all these arguments are going to need something like this because they all want to move from a claim about the impermissibility of a combination to the impermissibility of one of the combines. That's not a word. Well, it is a word, but it's not that, that's not the right word for that thing, but you know what I mean. Okay, so, and the reason we need that is because you clearly can't in general infer from the fact that some combination of preferences is impermissible to the conclusion that any of them singly is rationally impermissible, right? So think about I mean, it's obvious, but think about intransitive preferences, right? You might prefer roux mince to watermelon, watermelon to chocolate cake, and chocolate cake to roux mince. That intransitive set arguably is rationally impermissible because each two is can result in you being money pumped. But it would be really weird if someone had those preferences and they fell foul of money pumping. It would be very odd to say to them, oh, dude, the problem here is this preference for roux mince over watermelon. Like, what's with that, dude? Like, obviously that preference is not rationally permissible, right? That seems like totally not the right thing to say there. The right thing to say is something like, you've combined these preferences in a bad way. The combination is no go, but there's nothing wrong with any of the preferences singly, right? They're all fine. It's okay to prefer roux mince to watermelon. Well, actually, I'm a vegetarian, so I feel like that actually is a bit dodgy, but you know what I mean. Okay, so it can't in general be that we can just seamlessly move from, oh, this combination is no good, to one guy in the combination is no good, at least one guy. So we need some principle that's going to allow us to make that move, and that principle is additivity, right? The additivity principle sort of says, well, if you can't see why combining these things is bad, then it's not just a function of the combination, it's a function of one of the guys himself being bad. Okay, so so the question that I'm kind of interested in now is, what is the status of additivity and what is the status of intuitive purchase, right? So the argument really relies on those two principles. What should we make of them? All right, so one way you might try and attack additivity is to think, look, maybe there are sort of descriptive facts about how people are which suggest that additivity must be false. So suppose we were to find out that people were distributed throughout the population such that a whole bunch of people are strongly risk averse, a whole bunch of people are future biased, and very few, if any, people combine these preferences. Then you might try, I don't know how well this argument's going to go, but you might try and marshal some kind of argument on the basis of these descriptive facts to say something like, look, what this suggests is that it really is the combination itself that's the problem here and not any of the preferences singly, right? The fact that people are thus and so is some evidence that in some way maybe they tacitly see that the combination is a bad thing, but regardless, there's some reason to think that if people are thus and so, then it's just the combination that's bad. I don't know exactly how good this argument, I haven't spent any time trying to spell this argument out, but I have some vague intuition that someone could try and make that kind of case. And if that were the case, then you'd have reason to think that additivity is false, and then the kind of those arguments that appeal to it wouldn't go through. Okay, so you might think that there's a kind of argument from future bias and strong risk aversion being anti-correlated to the conclusion that additivity is false, right? So the thought would be, well, if people are just not signing on for both of these preferences, but plenty of people signing on for each of them singly, that suggests that people are sort of tacitly recognizing that each preference is fine, but the combination is bad. So amongst other things, we were interested to know whether future bias and strong risk aversion were in fact correlated or anti-correlated, partly as a way of evaluating additivity. We were interested in a whole bunch of empirical stuff, of which only some little section are the things I'm going to tell you about. Okay, so we undertook some empirical research. Frankly, I was just also kind of interested in the question, can you turn people into pain pumps? I just wanted to know, like, this seemed like a cool thing to do. So since we had money, I was like, yes, let's do that thing. So we ran a study that used a kind of amended version of Tom's thought experiment. Here's what we found. People were roughly evenly divided between being risk averse and not, and between being future biased and not. So roughly 50% of the population were risk averse and roughly 50% were future biased. That's a slightly lower number of future biased people than we typically get in our studies, but I guess it's within the realm of fluctuation. And there was no association between either of them, neither positive or negative. So they certainly were not anti-correlated. So what we find then is that 25% of people show both preferences, and that's just the intersection, right? I thought that was kind of cool. Like 25% of people could be turned into pain pumps. I don't know how I can use this in my day-to-day life, but I was like, oh, that's interesting. So if future bias is in fact rationally permissible, then it's definitely not harmlessly slow, right? Because a quarter of the population are prepared to make a sequence of choices that actually create more pain and for no benefit. That's also kind of interesting. Okay, so back to additivity. Given that people freely combine risk aversion and future bias, we didn't find any evidence for this idea that this kind of descriptive claim that you might hope to marshal in favour of an argument against additivity. So there's no support for any such argument, the argument that I really didn't spell out but just kind of gestured towards from this kind of quarter. But of course that doesn't show that additivity is true. So my first thought here is that on the face of it, it looks like there might be a kind of dilemma here in terms of additivity and intuitive purchase. So remember, intuitive purchase is this premise 3, which says that there's no strong intuitive purchase on the mechanism that rules out our combining P1 and P2, where P2 is future bias and P1 is strong risk aversion. And one question you might have is, well, what on earth does it take for it to be true that you have intuitive purchase on why combining preferences is rationally impermissible? Like what exactly is required there? And I don't know, like that seems like an incredibly difficult question to answer. But it seems like you might have thicker versus thinner views about what it takes to kind of understand why combining these preferences in this way is shit. So maybe all it requires is something fairly thin, right? Maybe all that's required is that you kind of show people a little thought experiment and you work through and they totally see that the combination leads them astray, right? So you can imagine doing this for intransitive preferences. I did this for a Labradoodle owner in the UK, right? I just walked her through how it could be that Annie could money pump her dog if her dog had intransitive preferences. Because there was a dog example, she was like yeah, I totally see this, right? So she understood how it could be that her dog could be money pumped. Good thing her dog has plenty of money. Okay, so you might think, well, that's kind of all that's required to have some intuitive purchase on why you shouldn't combine things in a kind of intransitive way. Then it does look pretty plausible that we have intuitive purchase on a kind of range of cases that you might think of as being ones where it is impermissible. So it seems plausible that we then have a kind of intuitive purchase on why you shouldn't combine preferences in a kind of intransitive way. And it seems plausible that we have intuitive purchase on why you shouldn't put them together in a way that allows you to be Dutch booked. And it also seems plausible that we have but in that case, it also seems plausible that we have intuitive purchase on why combining future bias and strong risk aversion is rationally permissible, right? So how is it that we kind of come to see these facts about intransitivity? Well, someone kind of gives us a toy example and we work through it and we're like, oh, I see what's happened here. But you might think, look, what Tom has given us by this little case, this little thought experiment in which you get these series of choices on these schedules, what he's done is just give us a thought experiment in which when we see what happens, we see that combining these preferences in this way is no good, and that just is to have intuitive preferences, intuitive purchase on why we shouldn't combine them thus and so, right? And what you might think is we don't have any less intuitive purchase in that case than we do about Dutch bookies and intransitive preferences. So if that's the view you take, though, then that third premise, intuitive purchase, turns out to be false, because that premise says that we don't have intuitive purchase on the mechanism that rules out combining future bias and strong risk aversion, right? But given a sufficiently thin view about what it takes to have intuitive purchase, that premise seems like it doesn't go through. So then, obviously, the argument doesn't go through because that's how arguments work. Okay, alternatively, suppose you have a kind of figure notion of what it would take to have intuitive purchase on why you can't combine preferences, right? Then you might think, okay, so just seeing how Tom's thought experiment goes, that's not enough. So all you really see is this guy makes a series of choices and he ends up with an additional minute of pain, but like doesn't really tell you, doesn't really get you an understanding of like why you shouldn't combine those things, you might think. Okay, fair do. So then you should think that premise 3 of the argument is true. We don't have intuitive purchase on why combining those things is bad. But now it's just way not obvious that we have intuitive purchase in a lot of these other cases either, right? So, think about, money pumping and Dutch book arguments. Like maybe some people in this room really work at the coalface here and like have this really crisp sense of why combining preferences in that way is not good. But it's just not obvious that in general, people find it any easier to understand or have any better real sense of why combining preferences in those kinds of cases leads to bad outcomes than they do in this kind of Doherty thought experiment case. So now the problem is it looks like, sure, we don't have intuitive purchase in the case of future bias and strong risk aversion. But now we also don't have intuitive purchase in all these other kinds of cases either. So we have no real sense of why combining other kinds of preferences is impermissible. Okay, but now this is a disaster because if that's the case, then we really have, it has to be that we reject additivity, right? Additivity must be false because it's going to follow from the truth of additivity and the truth of some kind of intuitive purchase principle that in all of those cases, at least one of the preferences that are being combined must be impermissible. But that's bollocks, right? We know that it's not going to be true for any set of intransitive preferences that at least one of them is singly impermissible. But that's just the conclusion we're going to get to if we run the very same argument and we accept that, for instance, we don't have intuitive purchase on why intransitive preferences are combinable. So the thought here is, then of course, if additivity is false, then again the argument fails. And the worry here is that there's a kind of instability here, which is that the more reason you have to think that intuitive purchase, that people do fail to have intuitive purchase here, namely that third premise is true, the greater reason you have to think that additivity must be false, because the greater reason you have to think that in other cases you also don't have intuitive purchase. And if you don't have intuitive purchase there, then it just must be that some other aspect of the argument is failing and it's got to be additivity. All right. Okay, so, but what if you don't buy it? So the thought here is that there's this kind of dilemma, and you're either going to have to end up saying that premise 3 is false, or you're going to end up having to say that premise 2 is false. But suppose you don't believe me about that, like shockingly. You're just like, I just don't see why additivity and intuitive purchase can both be true. Suppose you accept them both. You still, of course, haven't got yet to the conclusion that future bias is impermissible. All you've got to the conclusion at this point is that at least one of them must be, because what that gives you is the thought that because the combination is impermissible, one of the things combined must be. But it doesn't follow that the bad guy is future bias. Okay, so why think future bias is the bad guy, assuming that you think someone is, right? Well, one way you might try and answer that question is, again, by looking at some kind of descriptive data. So you might think, look, what makes it the case that preferences are rationally impermissible is something about whether they tend to promote you being better or worse off, right? So then you might think, well, we can try and figure out whether future bias is the bad guy or risk aversion is by kind of looking at the descriptive data and figuring out whether people who are future biased tend to be made worse off compared to the people who are strongly risk averse. And we can try and use that to discover, to mount an argument to the conclusion about which of the guys is the bad guy. Okay, so fortunately our empirical evidence also speaks to this kind of argument, or it speaks to it but in a completely unhelpful way. So we didn't find that people who are future biased tend to be worse off than those as strongly risk averse or vice versa. So the same proportion of risk averse people get into trouble by being future biased as future biased people get into trouble by being risk averse. So there's no kind of descriptive data that can suggest that future bias must be the bad guy. Likewise, though, it also doesn't suggest that strong risk aversion is the bad guy. It just tells you nothing, right? There's kind of no purchase to be had here. Okay, but there are some other arguments to the conclusion that future bias is the bad guy. So Tom thinks that it must be that future bias is the bad guy because he says, look, strong risk aversion is obviously permissible because otherwise it wouldn't be permissible to buy insurance from companies that make money. But like, that would be a nutty thing to think. So given that buying insurance is fine, it follows that strong risk aversion is fine, and it follows that future bias is not fine, roughly speaking. That's how that goes. Okay, so is that a good argument? Well, there's a few reasons to be a bit wary there, right? So the original Doherty thought experiment is a thought experiment about pain and being strongly risk averse in relation to pain, where the pain experiences are not supposed to exhibit increasing marginal disutility. But strong risk aversion with respect to money, and therefore insurance, is standardly justified by the increasing marginal disutility of monetary losses. So the thought here is, look, even if it's true that strong risk aversion with respect to insurance is fine, and we should all be buying insurance from, money-making companies, or at least it's permissible to be doing so, it doesn't follow that strong risk aversion with respect to pain is fine, because the kind of thing that justifies the strong risk aversion in the monetary case doesn't seem to justify it in the pain case. So the inference from, buying insurance is sensible to being strongly risk averse about pain is sensible, doesn't seem like it goes through. So if that's right, then we don't, that Tom's sort of argument for why we should think that future bias is the bad guy rather than strong risk aversion doesn't go through. Another thing you might try and say is, look, it's not even obvious that buying insurance from these money-making companies is a matter of being strongly risk-averse. You might think that the only cases in which doing that is uncontroversially rational is where there are kind of long-term unrecoverable losses, like the sort of losses you get when your whole house burns down and you've got nothing, right? And the idea might be, look, that does a whole bunch of things. It kind of destroys your earning capacity. And in those cases, the kind of real dollar loss might be so high that purchasing insurance just straightforwardly maximizes expected monetary value. So it's actually not strongly looks strongly risk averse, but it's actually not strong risk aversion at all. And if that's the right account of the rationality of buying insurance, then it's not going to follow that being strongly risk averse is rational, right? Because buying insurance is rational, but that's not a matter of strong risk aversion. And so consequently, it certainly doesn't show that being strongly risk averse when it comes to pain is permissible. Okay, here's another argument to the conclusion though, that future bias is the bad guy. Okay, suppose that Annie, Freddie and Chance have a bunch of friends and that include Hanley. And they notice that often when they go out to the park with their friends, there ends up being an altercation. And they're totally puzzled by this because all their friends seem like reasonable, calm, nice doodles. These are all dogs, obviously. And when they think about it more closely, they notice that the fights only happen when Hanley's in the park. In fact, it doesn't matter which of their other friends are there, as long as Hanley's not there, it's all good, and as long as Hanley is there, there's a fight. And that's true even though if Hanley goes to the park and there are other people in the park but not their group of friends, nothing happens, right? So you might think, well, look, suppose that's how things were. What should they infer about what's going on here? And you might think, well, it's pretty natural for them to conclude that, like, well, Hanley's the problem doodle here, right? He's the common denominator whenever there are fights. So the simplest explanation is that there's a problem and the problem is Hanley. So we might try and offer something like this kind of best explanation argument, which is like, look, there are multiple combinations of preferences that are rationally impermissible and they share a member in common, and that member is future bias, right? But the best explanation for these combinations being ones that are impermissible is that future bias preferences are rationally impermissible, and that's because, like, he's the guy that's in common. But if the best explanation is that future bias preferences are impermissible, then future bias preferences are in fact impermissible, right? So I think something like this argument is compelling, assuming you buy something like interest in the best explanation and are not wading into the waters of whether you should do that. I think that's compelling if you begin with the assumption that one of the preferences in each rationally impermissible combination is impermissible, right? So if you've already signed on to additivity and intuitive purchase and you think, look, this combination is bad, so somebody in this combination's got to be bad, then in the case of the dog park, if you're like, look, these dogs are sometimes fighting, so some dog's got to be bad. Which dog is the bad dog? Conditional on one of the dogs being bad, I think it's a fair guess that the bad dog is Hanley, right? So I think that something like this argument should lead you to think that future bias is the bad guy if you've already signed up to additivity and intuitive purchase. But the original arguments don't show that you should draw that conclusion because it's actually just not clear that you should accept both additivity and intuitive purchase. And in fact, I suggested that they kind of pull in opposite directions. So reasons to think that intuitive purchase is true are reasons to think that additivity is false. And if one of them is false, then it could just as easily be that different combinations of references are impermissible and for different reasons, right? Different dogs get together and like different shit goes down. And it doesn't have to be like there's one dog that's the bad dog. And that can be true even if there are some shared preferences between the combinations, or in this case, like Hanley is shared between the doggy fights. Okay, so in sum, so I do think these sorts of arguments show that future bias is not inert, right? So it does make a difference to what you do. And I think that's kind of interesting. And I do think that when combined with other preferences, it can make a difference to what we choose and to hence to give what we get. And we know from our empirical work that about 25% of people are in fact disposed to be pain pumped. So they will combine future bias and strong risk aversion in this way that results in them being worse off. So the combination is not harmless in the sense of that, plenty of people in fact display the combination. That's also kind of interesting. But I think that there's not good reason to think that any of the preferences singly are rationally impermissible, even if the combination is, because I don't think there's good reason to accept both additivity and intuitive purchase, like both of them simultaneously. So there's not a good reason to think that future bias is singly rationally impermissible, kind of arising from this argument. Okay, that's the end.
We'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll be back here for Q&A.